Okay, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome again to the Washington Policy Pulse. My name is Nathan Dean. I'm a senior policy analyst. Said that so quickly, I was like senior policy analyst in Washington D.C. And we want to talk with what's happening in Washington this week, April 7th, 2025. Now, I'm going to start with some of the non-tariff related items. If you are in the chat, please feel free to put questions in related to the tariffs. We certainly will be able to answer those, but I just want to give you time to make sure that you get those questions in. So let's go ahead and start with the other big news that happened over the weekend, and that is the Senate passed the budget resolution to extend President Trump's tax cuts. Now, this was by a 51-48 vote. Remember, this is using the reconciliation process, so there's no filibuster here. Again, please remember that this is a blueprint. There's no specific language in here, no things like targeting the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, or Medicaid, or SNAP benefits, et cetera. But there are some interesting differences between this and the House plan. Now, if you remember, at a high level, President Trump wants to do one big, beautiful bill. And the key goal here is to extend the Trump era tax cuts from 2017, which will cost approximately $4.5 trillion. Now, what the Senate plan did is it essentially just presumed that the current baseline of that is zero. So rather than having to come up with $4.5 trillion worth of cuts, they can just presume that it's current policy. And so the cost of extending those tax cuts are effectively zero. Now, what they did is they didn't throw it through the Senate parliamentarian. They said that, they asked the Senate parliamentarian, and I'm paraphrasing here, can we just proceed with this and we'll get to the actual decision later. And what the Senate parliamentarian said is that it's appropriate for debate. Now, the Democrats will like to say that the Senate parliamentarian didn't sign off on it. Senator John Thune is saying the Senate parliamentarian gave them blessing to move forward, so they effectively went forward. Now, a lot of questions have always come in of what happens if the Senate parliamentarian says you can't do this. Well, effectively, you could always just fire the Senate parliamentarian, or you could ignore the Senate parliamentarian. There is another thought out here is that rather than the Senate parliamentarian being the one to actually approve on this, maybe it's the Senate Budget Committee that approves on it, that's led by Senator Lindsey Graham. And if that's the case, if the Democrats have an issue with it, then they'll raise it in committee, they'll get their votes turned down, and then they'll move forward. There's been a lot of speculation, is this a way of getting rid of the filibuster or not? We'll save that for another day, but I think the most important thing is to talk about what is in this Senate plan. So what does the Senate plan do? Well, it extends and makes permanent those tax cuts. So $4.5 trillion in tax extensions made permanent. There's increased military spending, approximately $150 billion. There's $175 billion for enhanced border security. It proposes increasing the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. This is a little bit different than the House one. The House was $4 trillion. And it only has, this is where the big difference between the House is that the House plan targets approximately $2 trillion in worth of spending reductions over the next decade, which also included mandatory spending like Medicaid. And what the Senate plan said is that they're only estimating around $4 billion. So $2 trillion versus $4 billion. And it obviously deferred a lot of the specific reduction ideas. So if you are an investor and you're looking at the three key provisions that we're looking at in terms of this debate, Inflation Reduction Act, SNAP benefits, Medicaid, the Senate plan effectively allows them to move forward and have minimal tweaks for it. Obviously, you'll get some of it in the Inflation Reduction Act, the Clean Energy, the Electric Vehicle Tax Credit, some maybe the Greenhouse Reduction Fund, and so forth. But overall, Republicans would then be able to continue with this idea of extending those tax cuts, and you wouldn't even have to cut anything in return. The House plan obviously is a little bit different, would require some substantial cuts because you need around $2 trillion of cuts, and a lot of that would most likely come from Medicaid. When it comes to Medicaid, just keep in mind, Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri had a conversation with the president last week, and President Trump, again, I'm paraphrasing here, told him, I'm not signing a House bill that has Medicaid, I'm not signing a Senate bill that has Medicaid cuts, I'm not signing any bill that has Medicaid cuts. So that's a challenge. When it comes to SNAP benefits, $230 billion is being earmarked by the House committees to try and pay for some of this. Well, the chairman of the House Agricultural Committee, Glenn Thompson, who has a hearing on this tomorrow, has already said there's not going to be any SNAP cuts via reconciliation, and there's not going to be any SNAP cuts via the Farm Bill. And these are Republicans. And we've talked about in the past how 21 Republicans have already sent a letter saying, please don't touch the Inflation Reduction Act. So with all these Republicans saying that they don't want to touch certain things, how are you going to pay for it? The Senate plan is the easiest way to do it. Now, the problem with the Senate plan, for those of you who obviously follow this, deficits. The deficit would most likely go extremely up because even if, that's a very technical term, extremely up, I apologize for that, but if you're presuming $4.5 trillion worth of tax extensions, another $1.5 trillion in additional tax stimulus, think no taxes on tips, and so forth. Well, yes, you are going to get some economic growth assumptions. Yes, Republicans will most likely try and use tariffs as a way to justify some of this, but more likely than not, you are going to see a substantial increase in the deficit. We'll have some analyses on that later as we get closer and closer to the specifics. So where are we in all this? Well, obviously Congress wants to pass this sooner rather than later. Howard Lutnick was just on television this morning saying that, the sooner that Congress does this, the sooner they can put tax stimulus into the economy to negate some of this tariff uncertainty. Now, for what it's worth, I don't see much tax stimulus in here. I don't see where that would come from in the Senate plan, so just keep that if you will. But obviously, I don't think this is going to happen sooner rather than later. I have originally always said that I think this will happen by October, but if the Republicans continue to presume that the debt ceiling is going to be in this reconciliation plan and the debt ceiling X date comes up by August, then don't be surprised if they come up with a solution June or July. The other thing that can be said is, when does President Trump get into the nitty gritty of these negotiations? And that's where I think a lot of this deficit concerns, because one of the biggest questions we get is, well, okay, if the Senate plan says there's a massive deficit increase, what about these deficit hawks in Congress, specifically on the House Republican side? I think President Trump ultimately goes face to face with them and says, are you going to derail my plan? Are you going to be that person? Because you're not going to derail my plan. And I think those House Republicans would cave. Now, on the debt ceiling, I've said this before and I'll say that again, is that we really don't care if it's going via reconciliation or not. If it is a bipartisan plan, we have gotten some feedback from folks out there who think the Democrats would use the debt ceiling as leverage. I completely agree with that. But I think if given the choice between using leverage and then facing another economic issue, I almost said disaster, but I wouldn't want to say that, an economic crisis, if you will, then I think the Democrats would make a deal. So again, I think the debt ceiling is going to be resolved. So that's what we're hearing on the Senate budget resolution plan and the next steps for that. A couple other things to keep in mind. Jamison Greer, who is the trade representative, he's going to be testifying to the Senate Finance Committees and the House Ways and Means Committees this week. This is probably one of the best ways that you're going to see congressional pushback against tariffs. And I'll talk about tariffs in a second. But, if you are looking for a catalyst moment that could potentially signal that Congress is going to be more of a force against tariffs, it could most likely come in those two hearings. Michelle Bowman, who is the Fed governor, who has been nominated to be the Fed vice chair for supervision, is also going to have her confirmation hearing. This is going to be on Thursday in the Senate Banking Committee hearing. Now, they've actually combined it with 4 other individuals, so she probably is not going to get that many questions. But, for us, the 4 most important things on the financial regulatory side is she going to alter the GSIB surcharge? Is she going to alter the stress test? Is she going to put a capital neutral Basel III endgame? And is she going to change the enhanced supplementary leverage ratio, the ESLR? All 4 of those she has hinted in the past about doing. I want to see if she can give us any priorities. If she doesn't, my first priorities, I think, for her will be the GSIB surcharge and stress testing, followed by the Basel III endgame, and then ultimately the ESLR. So let's turn to tariffs. So the main question that we have gotten from clients is, do we think President Trump is going to reverse on tariffs? And the answer is I don't think so. Now, it's always feasible that President Trump could, announce an extension, that these things won't take place and so forth. You notice I'm constantly looking at my terminal because I have this really bad fear that as soon as I say this, I'm going to see a red line saying that he's actually done this. But, look, I think President Trump is in here for the long haul. If you think about it, most Americans do not have assets in the stock market, or if, yes, okay, I'm checking my terminal. Thank you very much. Checking my terminal. I'm seeing a video. I've seen that he spoke with Japan, but I'm not seeing anything that suggests he's pushed it off. But obviously, send in the headline if if you've seen it other way. But where I'm going with this is that because most Americans don't have assets in the market, President Trump doesn't really see this all of, oh, there it is. Thank you very much. President Trump considering a 90-day pause in tariffs for all countries except China. There you go. So, again, it's one of those things where it's really hard to predict, but, we have to plan for these things because ultimately it may happen. Howard Lutnick was on television. Peter Navarro was on television this morning talking about how, just these markets and the way they're acting is not exactly impactful of the American consumer, but again, we'll see. The other thing that I would say is that there has been more pushback from Republicans in terms of legislation to try and claw back some of that terminal, or sorry, it got me thinking about the terminal now. Republicans have actually pursued legislation. We saw bipartisan legislation last week, and we're going to see bipartisan legislation in the House this morning, clawing back some of the president's authority on tariffs, and effectively it would give Congress a 60-day time period to say yay or nay on any tariffs that are announced. What I will say here is the Senate essentially has 4 days to pass this legislation before they're gone, and it's not going to happen in 4 days. And so the Senate is gone later this week. They don't come back until April 28th, and so from the congressional time period, it's only a 2-week break, but for those of us in the markets, you can imagine this is something, it's like 400 days in the market. So I don't anticipate you're going to see many folks in Congress push back and say we need to claw this back. I will say is that as we get closer to the midterm elections, you will obviously see a lot more concerns of the tariff impact and the consumer impact on of these tariffs. We've seen it from Senator Tom Tillis, who is North Carolina. He's running for re-election. Obviously, you've seen it from Senator Collins up in Maine, Canadian border state. So obviously, she's impacted by this. Senator Grassley and the Iowa farmer debate. You've seen a lot of this talk as well. So again, you're going to see this angst if it continues. And just now that I'm looking at it, and I see that President Trump is considering this delay, that just doesn't really change much in terms of giving us clarity or certainty. It just allows for more negotiations. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to ask if there's any questions, anything else that we can assist with. The last thing that I would just leave is just that please remember, if you have a terminal, the easiest way that you can see all of the BI related news is to go to BI tariff. And I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay, so you should see this is BI tariff. You just type this in. So if you have a terminal, just go to BI tariff and you click on all right here. This gives you every single Bloomberg Intelligence and every single Bloomberg Economics piece that puts out on tariffs. And so when people ask, how do I track tariff and how do I track the analysis and so forth like that, this is how I do it, is via BI tariff. The other thing I would just keep in mind if you're new to this is that NI tariff is essentially the hashtag tariff, but for Bloomberg News and for all the other news stories that we have. So if I go to Bloomberg News, the source is BN, you'll see a lot of this right here in terms of all the news articles that are coming on via the terminal. So I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to say thank you again for participating in today. Thank you again for coming. Apologize that we had to do that red terminal, but thank you to the client who sent that over. I really appreciate it. And if we can ever be of assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.